Great.
Was a starter recording. So I'm going to introduce. Uh, so, uh, so thank you and welcome to my meeting. So today, with the rise of individual Christians like 33s in Nigeria, challenging the church's orthodoxy on topical issues like tithing, I'm asking if Christianity in Nigeria witnessing the same thing it witnessed in Europe during the Reformation. And is this a good or a bad thing for the church in Nigeria or the African society at large? Now, joining me to discuss this is Alkesh Woods, a Christian missionary now living and studying for his master's degree in Kenya. I first met Alkesh at the Renmin University of China, where I was studying for my master's degree. And he was a lecturer at the same university, teaching the English language. Alkesh Woods was a regular at the International Church in Beijing, China, where many Africans were also members. So now, Alkesh, can you please give us a view of the International Church in Beijing in terms of the demographics and how represented the Africans were at the church? So please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Faye. Yeah, so I think I was there. It's 5 years. It's interesting that church was actually planted. Not there's been international church in Beijing, and I think the rest of China for a while. Basically, a lot of them since the early 80s. I think the international church began basically among, at that time, the international population was pretty small. There was just a handful of diplomats. And so I think those diplomats started their own church. And I think it began in the British Embassy. Not that the British government was endorsing it, but they just needed to find a place. And kind of in those days, I think getting any government approval for a religious gathering would have been extremely difficult outside of the kind of the what they call the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. Anyway, that grew and grew, and actually, well, at least before COVID, I can't speak for after COVID because I don't really know how things changed exactly. But before COVID, that was a lot bigger. But they planted in 2004, I think it was, and that was because they realized around the early 2000s, they realized that there were a lot of a lot of international students, places like BLCU, Beida, Tsinghua. Sorry, some listeners might not know. These are all just big universities in Beijing. I think some of them now, or at least pre-COVID, I think BLCU, Tsinghua, Beida all had around or over 1,000 international students at each one. So it made sense that a lot of those people were Christian. They wanted a place to worship on a Sunday. There are a number of local churches, and there are some that do English. And in fact, the first church I went to for the first 2 years was exactly that. And some people, if they want to look it up, and if you're interested, it's quite famous because because of its English service. I think it's called Haidien Christian Church. But yeah, Haidien Christian Church. But the thing about that church is, even though they have an English service, it's not really geared towards. Quite honestly, it's not geared towards Christians, which might sound a bit funny, but basically they realized that a lot of people, a lot of students in that part of Beijing are quite interested in learning English, and they kind of also want just a feel of, what they consider Western culture to be. And so I think they like the idea that, I can go to a church, it's in English. I'll tell you, there was one professor, or a few professors, I think, at the university I used to be, Beijing Foreign Studies University, and they actually kind of sent their students as a sort of I don't think they sent them there specifically, but they actually encouraged them to go there just to check it out, to see what a church
more
looks
like a cultural center. They saw it more as a cultural center.
Yeah, yeah. Because I met some people there at Easter, and I was surprised there were so many from our university. But and they said our professor had told us to check out a service at Easter time. So, but ours wasn't like that. Ours was, even though it was established by internationals, most of those weren't students. But over time, the leadership increasingly was student led. Kind of, in the church you have elders and deacons. Our church kind of had a number of elders.
So under what ministry does the church belong? Was it Anglican or Catholic or?
Yeah, so it's funny really. Not really anything. As you can see, the church sort of organically developed. Different people were there. I'll be honest, people were there to do ministry related things, mostly among locals. But many of them wanted a place to go to on Sunday, and it wouldn't have made sense for them to go to a local church. It would have been too dangerous to do that, legally speaking.
If I get you correctly, it was more about finding, and it was more like an ecumenical brotherhood, an ecumenical center where Christians from all
sorry, exactly, So I mean, you'd find people in our church who were Anglican, who were from Pentecostal background, from Baptist background, from Presbyterian, from Catholic, from Lutheran, from really just kind of a generic evangelical kind of statement of faith. And I think that was actually a real strength of the church, because you notice that we weren't kind of so big on, we have to connect with this bishop or whatever. It was just like, well, we're here to worship God, to learn about him through his word, to live for him, and to prepare to go back home, to reach out to other internationals that we're studying, working with. I mean, Katie, my wife and I enjoyed it so much. We'd like to continue doing that ministry. It's quite I think, in the past it seemed like quite a specialized thing, but more and more I'm realizing that around the world, these international churches are actually quite big, and actually they struggle to find people. Our passion would be to actually go out and do that ministry. A lot of the problems the ministries have is that they don't have that many people who have that focus, because it does seem weird. Why go all the way to China and then be leading a church which ours was 70 to 80% African? But I think I think I really enjoyed being part of that church, and meeting yourself and lots of other people on our campus as well.
Absolutely. Now you may mention earlier on that that at the start of the establishment of the International Church in Beijing, I don't know if it's the one in Haidie you're talking about, but you said at the start of the establishment of the church, it was a bit difficult to get government approval. So now tell us, and in recent times, we've been hearing about the Chinese government not being very friendly with Christian missionary activities. I mean, I've heard it on the BBC before. I think on one of the episodes of the religious program, the faith and religious program, which is called what is the title of that program? Heart and Soul, where a Jehovah's Witness member was interviewed. She went to China to carry out her missionary activities, and then during the course of the program, and I mean, you can find this particular podcast on BBC's website. That is Heart and Soul. I think religion in China. Now the lady said something about them having to secretly send cryptic messages to members, and then they're not going to they're only going to decide on where they're going to meet for their meeting, just maybe few minutes to the start of their meeting. And this was to avoid the government focusing on that. So the question I'm going to ask you is, now, having been in China yourself and having engaged in Christian activities in China, is it true that the government actually has some kind of phobia for the church and not allowing freedom of worship?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess it's hard to speak about the Chinese government in one breath because the Chinese government is not made up of one individual. It's made up of lots of different people, and at different points in time, they've taken different views. For instance, I think it's Zhou Enlai, when he was talking about religious freedom in China.
You mean Zhou Enlai, the former premier, the prime minister of the country?
Yeah, the former premier. Yeah, so his take was something like, okay, we know according to Marx, religion is the opium of the masses, but basically because we know according to Marxism that religion will just die out, die a natural death once the workers are enlightened and take over the means of production and realize that communism gives them all these benefits. So he was saying, well, we should be happy to give people freedom, because we don't have to worry. We know that. Yeah, thanks. We know that he will. That the religion will just die out, so we don't need to worry about it. Of course, unlike even there, it's talking about the Cultural Revolution. During the Cultural Revolution, of course, basically all churches were shut, and it was very, very risky to publicly, say you're a Christian or publicly meet as Christians, because the purpose of the Cultural Revolution was to stamp out anything that was considered culturally to go against, Maoism, communist policy. And then in the 80s, under Deng Xiaoping, who kind of led the country for basically it was more than 12 years, I think. Was it 1978 to 1992, something like that? And under Deng Xiaoping, things gradually opened up. And, what you got kind of fast forward to today is a situation where you have quite a lot of churches which are free to meet under the government auspices. And that doesn't mean the government, doesn't cut their Bibles up based on communist agendas, but it does have a seat at the table in terms of appointing pastors or bishops or whatever.
Did you witness all through your time at the church? Did you witness the government interference at the international church, especially?
Or did I see the government? I think there was one time. So basically, how it worked was, the international church's kind of agreement with the government was this: you can meet, you can be fairly free in meeting at least a particular venue on Sundays. The only rule really was you are not allowed to admit locals into your congregation.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So when it's international, it doesn't just mean like many ministries, I think in Nigeria and Kenya are called international. This one literally meant only internationals.
And
Now, there were a few loopholes. For instance, we had an administrator who was local because he worked for the church. It was okay for him to be there. If you were married to an international, you could be there. Some rules about, maybe if you'd lived abroad for a few years and you had a visa or green card or something in America, you could live there. But overall, yeah, that was the rule. I mean,
what in your opinion is the reason why the locals you're not encouraged to bring in locals into the church?
Yeah, I think the overall philosophy is kind of the fear of, the traditional line at least was that Christianity is linked with Western imperialism, and so there's sort of this idea that the Westerners who are leading these churches are going to somehow corrupt or pollute local Chinese people according to their imperialistic ways or whatever it is. I mean, probably if you talk to the government officials, they'd say that unless you work through the government approved channels, which is the Chinese Christian Council and the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, at least among Protestants, they'd say that's the only way to get kind of a church to officially allow locals, and this is sort of some special dispensation. So it's kind of a funny legal status, to be honest, and it actually created problems when we talked to local authorities because they didn't really understand that status, as well as not the Religious Affairs Bureau. It's got a new name, but I think they keep changing its name. I think it's now under the Labour Work and Bureau or something. Anyway,
how does it work? Do they somehow censor the things you're allowed to teach, or
because of that rule, that gives us a large amount of freedom that most local churches don't have. So as I said, I only saw government officials. I think one Sunday they came. They very rarely come. And if they're coming, they're really only checking that, are we keeping the rule about, oh, sorry, they did come. I think they would come at Christmas because they think that's the time where lots of people go to church. So that the security would be a bit more then. But again, they're really just there to check that the people who are coming are internationals.
But what about the church? I understand there are some Christians in Christian Chinese locals. One of my professors was a Christian, and I think she.
Yeah, I think I know who that is. Is it Pan Shuya?
Yeah, yes.
Is that right?
That's her name. Yes.
Yeah. I knew
Professor Pan Shuya. She's a very, very great lady, very friendly. Okay. Now tell me, the churches where the locals are allowed to attend, are there some kind of regulations on what they can hear?
Yeah. So maybe I can speak firstly for the registered churches. So basically, under Chinese law, the church has to be registered, and in order to get registration, they usually need a few things, which include the pastor has to have attended one of the this is just for Protestants, by the way. Catholics is similar, but it's like a parallel structure. Three Self-Patriotic Movement Seminary. There's a really big one in Nanjing, and there are a few others around China. In those seminaries, sadly, increasingly, that's become more politicized. Kind of, they read textbooks that tell them kind of how to conform Christianity to Chinese values or whatever, which often is kind of a byword for socialist values. So that's one way they exert control. Another way they exert control is and I don't know all the details, but kind of the appointment of kind of the higher ups, those who are higher up than a pastor, somebody making decisions over a whole district. And often those people won't necessarily even be, well, they might actually, I think as far as I know, they might themselves be Communist Party officials, or the Communist Party will have a seat at the table in those councils.
Now, you mentioned the Catholic Church. You said it's got a kind of parallel structure. What exactly do you mean by that? Because I heard for a very long time, maybe due to the Vatican's position on Taiwan status, they had loggerheads with the Vatican. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party is against, has some issues with the Vatican.
Yes, I think there's two main issues. So I think one issue is that the Vatican doesn't recognize the People's Republic of China to be the legitimate government of the geographical region China. They recognize the Republic of China. And obviously in the West, we tend to just focus on Taiwan, because the Republic of China doesn't actually, in reality, currently only really controls the island of Taiwan. So they've not changed their stance, whereas obviously countries like America and most European countries, and now, why they didn't change that? Good question. I mean, I think the most obvious reason, the real question is why other countries changed. And it's easy for a European country or America or other countries to change because obviously they saw that the People's Republic of China was getting more powerful politically, militarily, economically, and it seemed in their interests to have an embassy there and have lots of good ties, and they felt that they could do that without compromising their ties to the Republic of China, Taiwan, which obviously America have sort of done that, although it keeps creating tensions, as you famously saw with Nancy Pelosi's recent visit. I think with the Vatican, because obviously it's kind of like a weird country that's sort of half an actual political entity. I've been to the Vatican. You have a sort of passport control within Rome, and it is sort of its own country. But obviously, in reality, the Vatican is a stand-in for the Catholic Church, and so I think the Catholic Church, just doesn't feel like they want to endorse a government which is, avowedly atheist and historically anti-Christian, and they would probably say still is anti-Christian, instead of a government which isn't like the People's Republic of China. I mean, not that the Republic of China is a Christian government, but if they have to pick one, I think I can see why they would pick. Yeah.
Now, I heard in recent times that the Catholic Church has actually reached some sort of agreement with the Chinese Communist Party, the Communist Party of China, and they now maybe have allowed the Catholic Church to have some sort of freedom within China. So I don't know. Do you know about that? Can you tell us, please?
I know that for a while, I don't know recent stuff. I know that for a while, so there's two issues. Okay, here we go. So no, there's two issues. So one is the Taiwan issue. I think the other issue is just how the Vatican, how the Catholic Church operates. In the Catholic Church, there's a belief in apostolic succession based on laying on of hands. So, they'll talk about the current Pope is sort of in the shoes of St. Peter. The idea is that Peter, Jesus' close disciple, laid hands on someone. I don't know, was that Clement? I don't know. Who laid hands on someone else? I think Clement, yeah. Or Polycarp, I don't know. Anyway, they laid hands on someone else. Eventually, it got to the current Pope, which probably historically is accurate. I'm not sure. But then the idea is that the authority for the bishops comes from the Pope downwards.
Yeah.
And so they have to appoint their own bishops from the cardinals. That's next below the Pope. And the problem is that the current kind of Catholic Church in China, you know, those priests were not, like those bishops were not originally appointed by the Pope or the cardinals in Rome.
Okay.
So why? Well, that's just how. I mean, the Catholic Church basically shut down during the Cultural Revolution, and when things open up again in the early 80s. I mean, yeah, you can see the picture there.
Yes.
That's sort of
Very
perhaps a sort of slanted way of seeing it. Yeah.
that's
I don't think
for
that.
the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and so that picture probably sums up what the Catholic Church's issue is. That they have strong objection to the idea that kind of a secular anti-Christian government should appoint who the bishops are for the Catholic Church. Sorry, one moment. Sorry, one moment. I'm realizing we also have 5 minutes left.
Yes.
I'm wondering if we could use this as time to take a brief pause, and then we
Yes,
can
of course.
come back in again.
Come back.
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that.
Problem. Okay, it starts.
All right.
So you're saying something about the Catholic Church.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry for the interruption. I was just saying that you know, basically the whole issue of apostolic succession means you know, it's hard for the Catholic Church to accept the bishops that were appointed in China kind of after the late 1970s, early 80s, because they had no direct line to the Pope. And for Catholics, that's quite important based on their views of kind of how the kind of succession from Jesus works and their view on tradition, church tradition. So my understanding is that some of them secretly made a trip to the Vatican, or maybe they didn't make a secret trip, but they kind of got some sort of secret blessing, and the Vatican tried to smooth things over by sort of having them sign something, or the Vatican sign something to basically say, you know, we bless you, now you're fully ordained by the Central Catholic Church. So I think some of the bishops in China did that. I'm not sure all of them did. I think that's why it's still a bit of a contentious issue.
Okay. Are the bishops all Chinese national, the Chinese ethnic Chinese peoples and or any of the ethnic groups in China?
Yeah, I'm fairly sure they are. So that was quite a big thing for, you know, after 1949, the Chinese Communist Party was quite big on the idea we want to remove any foreign influence, and I think that's why the Catholic Church has such a big issue, because for Protestants, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. You know, there doesn't need to be a direct line from Luther in Germany, Calvin in Switzerland, for somebody to be recognized as a Protestant church. All that matters is doctrine. and the teachers being ones who are, in line with
And the Church of
Jesus'
England.
teachings. Yeah. Well, you should never ask questions about the Church of England because it's
Yeah.
always a lot more complicated. The Church of England has it's sort of accepted the Catholic line, but also not, and it depends on which Anglican person you speak to. So you'll find there are some people who are Anglo-Catholic, so they would think pretty much the same as a Catholic Church. For me, I'm kind of more of an evangelical low church background. Personally, I don't see any particular need for bishops to be especially ordained by a special person in the Anglican Communion. I think the most important thing is in the Anglican Church that they align with the 39 articles which was set up in kind of the Anglican Church's infancy. I think it's also worth saying that another thing is, for me and for a lot of evangelicals within the Anglican Church, we're not that committed to Anglicanism being the only way. Obviously, traditionally, the Catholic Church believes that outside the Catholic Church there is no salvation. I think even the movie star Mel Gibson said that in an interview. He said something like, "Oh, my wife's Anglican, and it's basically a shame she's going to hell." But I mean, he was just reflecting on traditional Catholic belief since what they call Vatican II in the 1960s. Is it John Paul II? Is that right? The Pope John Paul II, or maybe not the second. I don't know. I think John Paul II. He oversaw the Catholic Church during that period, and they significantly liberalized the Catholic Church at that time. So I think you'll find that there aren't that many people in the Catholic Church today who will definitively say outside the Catholic Church there is no salvation. But among Anglicans, especially evangelical Anglicans, I'd say it doesn't really matter whether you're Anglican or not. It's a structure. Structures can be helpful for lots of different reasons.
Just to hold you there.
Must.
Just to hold you there, you said that the view of the Catholic Church on salvation is it is not available outside the church. But can I just share something with you? It looks like they've changed their stance now. This one. I think after Vatican II, the statement by Pope Pius was further explained by the Second Vatican Council. It was made clear that although salvation can only come through Jesus Christ and the Catholic Church, of which Jesus is the head, people outside the church can also achieve salvation. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly what I was saying. Since the Vatican II, things have changed. I think how you interpret that is probably where Catholics might fall on different lines. Not being Catholic myself, it's a bit hard to say all these things as an outsider, but my understanding is that the Catholic Church has never said to 100% you have to be, baptized member of the Catholic Church to be saved. Because, for instance, in the Gospels, I don't know if you're familiar with the story where there's a thief who's being crucified right next to Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
And, the others are jeering Jesus, but that one says, I believe, he says, we're being punished for things we did wrong, but this person's being punished when he hasn't done anything. And Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. So the Catholic Church recognizes, they're not going to say, oh, no, but he wasn't, baptized, or he wasn't given the sacraments or whatever, because they recognize there are these sort of emergency situations, and they always have. I think the bigger question is, what about somebody who's living in a country like we are right now, or I'm sure in Nigeria, where there's lots of Catholic churches around, but somebody's chosen not to be a Catholic? Can that person be saved? And I think what it just said is salvation's only through Jesus Christ in the Catholic Church, but people outside the church can be saved. What does that mean? Does that mean that it's because historically the Catholic Church has guarded the church's teachings that me, evangelical in the 21st century, saved? That would be a very broad kind of open interpretation of it, which I would sort of accept that to some degree, because I agree that the history of the Catholic Church was necessary for the gospel to be proclaimed in Europe and elsewhere. Whereas other people might say, well, this is for somebody who really wants to be a Catholic, but for whatever reason they don't have the opportunity or something like that.
Now, yeah. Let us hold you there. I would like to ask you, the first question I asked you at the start of this session is, you should give me a kind of demographics of the international church in Beijing. Now, since this video is more for Africans and our experience, I'd like to know what the population of the Africans in the international church in Beijing is. What's the percentage? How would you estimate the demographics of the Africans? So, what percentage do the Africans make of that church?
The church. I mean, I'd never had raw figures, but I've usually told people about, I'd say 70 to 80%.
70?
Yeah, to 80% of our membership were African. Yeah. And I think that's, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, the church was established to reach international students mainly, even though, internationals may or may not be students. And, it was situated in, very close to BLCU, which is an in Wudalco, which is a very international student-heavy part of Beijing.
Now, I'm coming. In your estimation, looking at the entire population of internationals in Beijing at the time, do you think there is a disproportionate population of Africans because obviously Africans are not the only foreigners in Beijing there. So, of course, we are going to bar the citizens from the non-Christian country, maybe the ones like the Middle East or elsewhere where Christianity doesn't hold a ground. But do you think overall, of all the places Christianity has dominated before, there is a disproportionate population of Africans in the international church than Christians than people from traditionally Christian countries? And does this, if that's the case, does this mean that does this show the difference in church participation and connection to religious activities in, say, the UK, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is definitely. Definitely, it was disproportionately, African. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think partly it's because most British people, and I met a number in Beijing, aren't. They would say they're not interested in religion, or maybe they went to Sunday school, but not so interested. And and then you've obviously got a lot of Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Indians, who again, there's not as many Christians among their population. Although we had some Christian Pakistanis and Indians.
At the international church,
you'd find also another thing. Yeah, at the international church. At least I know 2 or 3 Christian Pakistanis we had. And then we had, another thing is how long people are there. So a lot of people that come to Beijing or China to study from Europe and America, they tend to come for a much shorter period because they're just there for language learning or for a year abroad as part of their degree. A lot would just come for 1 semester. Whereas you'd find a lot of the Africans, they're coming for different reasons. they're coming for, you know, China's seen as more advanced when it comes to agricultural technology and engineering and things like that. So people from Africa would come to China to study, often usually for a minimum of 2 years to do a master's. Sometimes
Like
a
me,
master's course would be 3 years,
like my son.
and many would continue. Yeah. Oh, you did it. I didn't realize that. Okay.
So some of
Oh
them,
yeah, of course, you were studying. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course you
but
What were you
I didn't
studying again?
know. Oh, communication studies, journalism.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
I
So that
wanted
was a
to
2 or 3
hone.
year course.
Yes, yes. I wanted to have a background in communication for some of the things that I do, things like this.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, yeah.
great. So now you're
But
practicing
I'm
your
thinking,
skills in
of
Africa.
course, I'm still thinking of going back for a master's degree in physics. I don't know how possible that would be.
Yeah.
But then
So,
again, the last reason he just gave about the people from, say, the developed world, the UK, the US, and the rest of them, um, coming to China just for a shorter period of time. Do you think that's really the reason? Because I've been to the club once and you find people of all backgrounds there. I mean, why would
oh,
they,
yeah, no. Oh, sorry, what was that?
yeah, why would they want to come to, even though they're in China for a shorter period of time, would want to still remember to go to the club and don't go to church if actually church matters to them.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, even among Christians, like, you know, I had a few people who would be there for a semester. You know, I had friends that came to study in Beijing, although not all of them are European. And you know, what they would end up doing is, you know, it's not like they're against attending the church, but because they're in China for such a short period, I think they feel like while they're there, they want to kind of make the best use of the time, which means, like, you know, every weekend. So, I mean, there were some people, like, I remember a Japanese guy, basically every weekend he would be out of Beijing. You know, he'd be going to Xi'an, he'd be doing all the sites. Um, so yeah, it's just a different mentality, isn't it? You know, if I'm going on holiday with my family, I would like to go to the church there, but if I don't manage to go to church there, I'm not gonna like feel like, oh no, you know, I've really missed out. Whereas a lot of the African students, I mean, firstly, financially, they wouldn't have the opportunity to necessarily, you know, travel to all those places. And then, you know, secondly, they'd be there for long term. They might, you know, plan to maybe not. Well, yeah, they might be planning to work in China once they finish their degree. So they kind of feel a bit more like, you know, they should get kind of stuck into the church while they're there.
Okay, now I think we're going to put aside experience in China now and then come back to the topic of the discussion, which I posted to you earlier. Now, first of all, now we're going to try to talk about Africa's Christian experience. And you know, I sent you the issue about tithing, how it was an issue here in Nigeria and still is, because it continues to generate more conversation, more controversy, and more people, in my estimation, like one of the pastors that I, one of the pastors, one of like the KICC, that Kingsway International Church in London, the largest church in London. The pastor said, he's Nigerian actually, that after he came up with his, that's the OAP, the Honor Personality, that he came up with his 99 thesis, so to speak, uh, churches' income dropped by about 40%. I'm still going to find it on the internet. Going to be a link to that so you can see for yourself. So with all this experience, now I say to say, I don't know if you watched them or you read those links I sent, but is the church in Africa experiencing a sort of reformation that Europe experienced at some point in time? That's one of the questions I'm going to have. But before then, I want you to tell me from your interaction with the Africans, both in Beijing and over there in China, in Kenya, where you are, what is the impression of the Africans pertaining as regards to their Christian practice? How different is Christianity in Africa and among Africans from your experience compared to Europe or the UK where you're from?
A good question. I think I think the most obvious thing, I'm a historian. I think the most obvious thing is just different histories. I think for better or for worse, even if most people in Europe today wouldn't say to the teachings of Christ, or know him as their savior, like those values and biblical ideas aren't just things that you either believe or you don't. They're sort of like, they're like language. Like we're so influenced by a language, we can't avoid it. I'm learning Swahili, and I'm learning more and more. There are many things in Swahili that Kenyans don't know are actually strongly influenced by Islam, because they're Arabic words. For instance, the days of the week. In the days of the week in Swahili, Juma, was it Juma Napili, like the second day is Sunday. So Friday is Iljuma, is kind of like sort of the central day. And then Saturday is like day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. So that's influenced by the Islamic calendar. So in the same way, my point is, most people in Europe or America can't shake off, and I don't think they should need to shake off. I think they benefit from a lot of Christian assumptions. Things like the idea of human rights, I think, is intrinsically related to Christianity, for instance. Whereas in Africa, although there are some cultures like Ethiopia, or to some extent Egypt, at least among the Coptic Egyptians, that have had a very long history of Christianity. For most parts of Africa, it's been historically quite a recent thing, and therefore a lot of the cultural assumptions are based on what they call African traditional or indigenous religion.
Absolutely.
And so I think that affects things a lot. I think, obviously at the same time, another big thing is growth. The church has grown hugely in Africa, not just during the times that missionaries were there and under colonialism, but actually post-colonialism. And it's grown to some degree in a reaction to, I'd say, at least modern Pentecostal movements, which I'm mentioning that because you mentioned not Big Freeze, Daddy Freeze. I think, was Big Freeze a Batman character in an old Batman movie? Anyway, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Anyway, Mr. Freeze, I don't know. Anyway, basically, Pentecostalism has shaped a lot of African countries. Perhaps almost every African country has been affected by it. And when I mean Pentecostalism, I mean what I call neo-Pentecostalism, which is a bit different than the kind of classic Pentecostalism that came out of California.
Hello, you've gone. Okay, you.
Sorry, did I freeze?
Okay. You went off for a while. Right?
Yeah. What did I last say?
the kind of Pentecostalism we have in Africa here.
Oh yeah. So I was just saying Pentecostalism in Africa. Yeah, so it's shaping a lot of things in the churches, and another big difference I think that's important actually is is the influence of the Catholic Church, or at least that in Europe there was an assumption, at least the just chooses to believe in. I'm this idea that actually, you know, in the Catholic Church, it was an entire order of society was connected to Christianity, and the idea that, you know, Jesus was in. So, could say whatever they wanted. They were obviously bishops who were unknown.
I cannot see
am
you.
I?
Is something wrong with your connection? Hello? Hello?
No.
Is something wrong with your connection?
Can you hear me?
Oh, of course I can now. Hello? Can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I can hear you now.
You can hear me okay?
Of course, of course. So yeah. Now you.
So I guess it was.
Hello. Okay, can you hear me now? The connection appears not to be very.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I know. Maybe we'll have to leave it there in a few minutes. Let me just wrap up what I was saying, at least this last question. Yeah, I guess I was just saying that the history of the kind of structure of the church. So, you know, obviously most of Europe was under the Catholic Church. Even once kind of the Protestant Reformation happened, you know, there were still these sort of big structures that meant that people couldn't just say anything they wanted the pulpit or run the church however they wanted. They had to do it in line with a bigger church structure. Whereas what sadly you find in Africa is, you know, so many, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with this, so many churches split, and then you have like, you know, hundreds of tiny churches around, and you have that here in Nairobi. And you wonder who are those pastors accountable to? Where are they getting their teachings from?
Now,
and I think
you once said something to me. You said, you know, I asked you about comparing the church attendance that in Kenya to say the UK and other developed countries, and you said it's kind of like Europe in the 17th or 18th century, where you have a lot of Christian words but little change in heart. Do you think in Kenya there is so much Christian presence but little change in heart, or in among the African Christians?
Yeah, I do. And it's quite one really, because you know, back home in the UK, if I talk to someone and I say, you know, are you a Christian or not? Most people would say no. And so you know what, you know, at least you know where they stand. they're not claiming to live according to the teachings of Christ, according to the Bible. And I might, you know, as an evangelical, as a Christian, I would like to encourage them to follow Jesus. I think it's worth it. But you know, I know where they stand. If someone does say they're a Christian, I can assume that they actually, you know, follow Jesus, at least to some degree, not perfectly. All of us are sinners. In Kenya, if someone says they're a Christian, even if they say they're born again, I'm always a bit suspicious about what that means. I think I'm always looking for, you know, I need to get that to know that person a bit. and to know their lifestyle, to know kind of their, their beliefs for a while before I can really judge whether they actually know Jesus or not. Yeah.
Now, in your estimation, which is better? Is it what you have in the UK or the situation you have in Kenya, of course, which is what we have in Nigeria too?
I mean, they both have their challenges, don't they? I think in some ways, I like the fact in Kenya and other African countries, I think it's good that at least they claim to be following a certain standard.
Mm.
And I think that can shape things a bit, to follow biblical standards. But whereas in the UK, you'll find people, it's very hard to even encourage them. People don't even know how to rebuke someone in public, or well, like say some young people are misbehaving or something. Like I think in a lot of African countries, what I've seen here in Kenya is older people feel like there's at least a standard, perhaps a biblical standard or biblically influenced standard, perhaps I'd say. Yeah, by which, I mean, at our university, that's what like the dean of students does to students. She says, look, this isn't how we live as Christians, sort of. But then, in Britain, if you said that, people just laugh at you. They say, well, we're not Christian, so why do we care? And also, it's good to know that people are at least willing to come to church or listen to the Bible, whereas in Britain, that's quite a big hurdle. On the flip side, I think, as you're probably quite familiar with in Nigeria, it is very open to spiritual abuse. It's quite easy for people to manipulate the Bible to teach something which isn't really in line with what Jesus said at all, and people will follow it. And unfortunately, there's a real spiritual hunger. I think that would be the positive way of putting it in a lot of Africa. I think people do want to know what the Bible teaches and want to live it out. I think the problem is, for a lot of them, they've experienced a lot of false teaching, and at the same time, a lot of them are going to fall into the temptation of living for money, living for power, living for to increase their career or family status or whatever it is. Absolutely. And so it's not surprising that they find it attractive to go to a church with a pastor with a lovely suit that promises them if they give, they're gonna get rid, or they're gonna be healed from the sickness that they're undergoing or whatever. Yeah, so that's kind of how it sum things up.
Okay. Yes, I get your point. Now, what is your position on tithing? Is it because it caused a very big problem here in Nigeria among the Christians? So, what, in your opinion, what is your position on tithing? Is it something Christians should do? Is it something that is, now, as a Christian itself, is it something that if they do not do, they're going to die, like one pastor here in Nigeria? Is it something that is a command, like it's said among some people? What, in your opinion, is what in your position? What is your position on tithing? Please tell me.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can summarize it. I think I will probably have to go in a few minutes, and then also, I think to be able to talk a bit more about daddy freeze and other things. But maybe, yeah, just to end, I can summarize my position, or at least how I would understand it. And I'm not summing up the position of the whole church. I think there are two important truths about our identity in Christ. I think one is we're not saved by what we do. And that is something that can be challenging about the gospel, the idea that Christians accept that they're not perfect. They're sinners, and it's only because of what Jesus did on the cross that we can be forgiven by God, and by his resurrection we're made right in his sight. So in a sense, if somebody never gives a penny to the church, that doesn't mean that they are going to hell. Or that means that God's gonna punish them in some way.
Okay, we have
On the flip side, as Christians, we have been called to a purpose. We have a new identity. That's what people mean when they're born again. Not just a word that they say. It means that they live a new life, and the mark of that new life is that they love God and they love others. And I think loving God and loving others means that they would use the gifts that they've been given to do both.
Okay, now we have very little time left. Just one more question.
Yeah.
And now, with this discussion going on, and especially with social media being very available to most people now, do you think these kind of abuses we see in churches, I mean, you call it an abuse, right? And then with the fact that more people are becoming, with the spread of the internet among young people, now they can get ideas from secular Europe, secular America. Do you think these, as time goes on, would make the African church, the church in Africa, to experience the same issue it's experienced in Europe, which today it finds it very difficult to attract people to church? Do you think it's going to be the case in the future? In the near future?
It's a good question. I think the issues will be different, or it will play out in a different way. And the reason for that is, I think I'd say it will play out in a different way because on the internet, you don't get just kind of one thing that's one person saying. The reasons that Europe, I think, secularized is because there was a whole consensus among the academic and social elite that, as Nietzsche famously said, God's dead. He didn't mean literally God's dead. He meant that he's irrelevant to people's life. They've formed new ideologies. They've moved on. Whereas what you find on social media is, just as much as one person saying this thing, someone else is saying another. And it's kind of like hard to work out, what the truth is. So I think what you'll find is that there's a...
I think the
What's
whole
that?
I think the whole thing will eventually lead to a case where Africa becomes more like Europe, where religion plays a legal part of public life. What do you think?
Well, maybe that can be our discussion for next time.
Very much. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for honoring my invitation to come on this.
No, it was a pleasure again. And yeah, I did look at some of those links. It's a shame we didn't get to interact with that a bit more.
Yes.
It seems like an interesting character, this Daddy Freeze person. I didn't know he was half Romanian. That's interesting.
So some of the time we're going to talk about that, and maybe why the Christian church, even though it's working here in Africa and in the UK, the same Holy Spirit which the people here, the pastors here claim, has brought to the church, is still not getting ethnic British English people into the church. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So thank you so much. You have to go now. Bye-bye.
Sure. Okay, have a good week, or however long it is.